Hello dreamers. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy true tales wrapped in mystery, whispered through the wind of forgotten places, do not forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Your support helps these stories find their way into the quiet corners of more listeners' nights. Now settle in, and let the shadows speak. In the late autumn of 1935, nestled deep within the rugged folds of the Ozark Mountains in northern Arkansas, there stood a small, unassuming settlement known as Venora. It was not marked on most maps, not because it was hidden, but because it was simply too small to matter to the world beyond its own dusty lanes. Venora had no train station, no post office of consequence, and barely a general store that stayed open past dusk. Yet, to its 43 residents, it was everything. The town's heartbeat was a man named Thaddeus Wexley, a quiet, wiry man with a beard like frost and eyes that seemed to watch the clouds more than the people around him. He kept the town's only working clock, a tall grandfather piece that stood in the corner of his front parlor, ticking with a rhythm that had matched the pulse of Venora for over 2 decades. Every Sunday morning, without fail, children would gather outside his porch, listening to the chime that rang out precisely at 9 o'clock. It was their signal that church would soon begin. Venora thrived on routine. Mrs. Aloan Pruitt baked sourdough loaves every Tuesday and Friday, the scent curling through the hollows like an invitation. The blacksmith, a Swede named Boren Halvorsen, hammered horseshoes with a rhythm so steady, locals claimed you could set your pocket watch by it. Even the crows seemed to follow a schedule, arriving at dawn, departing at twilight, never one more or less than expected. But on the morning of November 4th, 1935, something changed. It began with silence. No hammer rang from Boren's forge. No bread scent drifted from Aloan's chimney. No children laughed near Thaddeus's porch. When Jedediah Crane, the town's lone mail carrier, rode his mule down the main dirt track just after sunrise, he found every door closed, every curtain drawn, not unusual in itself but unsettling in its completeness. He knocked on 3 houses. No answer. He called out names into the mist. Only echoes replied. By mid-morning, word spread to the nearest neighboring town, Winslow, some 12 miles east. Sheriff Elias Griggs arrived by truck just after noon, his boots kicking up red dust as he stepped onto Venora's main street. What he found defied reason. Supper plates sat on tables, still warm in some homes. A kettle steamed on a stove. A child's doll lay face down in the dirt near the schoolhouse steps. Yet not a single soul remained. There were no signs of struggle. No overturned furniture. No footprints leading away, only the soft, undisturbed blanket of fallen sycamore leaves that had drifted down the night before. It was as if the town had simply exhaled and vanished on the breath. Investigators from Fayetteville arrived 2 days later. They interviewed Jedediah, examined every inch of every cabin, tested the well water, even brought in bloodhounds. The dogs circled Thaddeus Wexley's house 3 times, then sat by the grandfather clock, whimpering. The clock itself had stopped, at precisely 11 minutes past midnight. No one could explain it. Rumors bloomed like late-season weeds. Some said a government experiment had gone wrong in the hills. Others whispered of a traveling preacher who'd visited the week before, speaking in tongues and warning of a cleansing wind. A few even claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky that night, soft, pulsing orbs that hovered over Venora's ridge like watchful eyes. But the truth? The truth remains locked in the Ozark fog. To this day, Venora does not appear on any official map. The land was eventually absorbed into federal forest reserve, and trees have long since grown over the foundation stones. Yet, in certain quiet moments, especially in the hour between midnight and dawn, hunters and hikers report hearing faint chimes. Not from any church bell but from something older, slower, like a clock counting down to a moment that never came. And if you listen very closely, just before the wind picks up, you might hear a name whispered through the pines. Thaddeus, Aloan, Boren, Jedediah, as though the earth itself is trying to remember them. For weeks following that eerie November morning, the disappearance of Venora's 43 souls gripped the imaginations of newspapers from Little Rock to St. Louis. Headlines screamed of ghost town swallowed by night, and mountain enigma defies logic. Yet as quickly as the frenzy began, it faded. The Great Depression weighed heavy on the nation's conscience, and mysteries without answers were soon buried beneath more pressing sorrows. But one man refused to let go. Silas Merrow was not a detective, nor a journalist, nor even a native of Arkansas. He was a geologist from Vermont, hired by the U.S. Geological Survey to map mineral veins in the Boston Mountains. He had passed through Winslow on October 29th, just days before Venora vanished, and had stopped in the settlement for a single night to rest his mule Juniper. He remembered the townsfolk with startling clarity. Boren Halvorsen had offered him a cup of bitter chicory coffee, Eloan Pruitt pressed a honeycomb biscuit into his palm, and Thaddeus Wexley had spoken only 3 words to him: "Storm's coming soon." Silas returned to Winslow on November 10th, expecting to resupply before heading deeper into the range. That was when he heard the news. At first, he assumed it was exaggeration, rural gossip magnified by isolation. But when he rode to Venora himself, guided only by memory and a sun-bleached trail marker, what he found chilled him to the bone. The settlement stood exactly as it had been, except for the people. A rocking chair still swayed gently on Thaddeus's porch, though no breeze stirred the air. A quilt lay half-folded on Eloan's bed, one corner trailing onto the floorboards. In the schoolhouse, a slate board bore the words, "The sky is wide," written in a child's careful script, unfinished as if the lesson had been interrupted mid-breath. Silas spent 3 nights in Venora, sleeping in Boren's smithy with his rifle across his lap. He listened. He watched. And on the 3rd night, just past midnight, he heard it, a low, resonant hum, like stone vibrating deep beneath the earth. It lasted no more than 10 seconds, then ceased. The next morning, he found strange markings on the well curb, a series of concentric circles burned, not carved, into the wood as though branded by heatless fire. He took notes. He sketched. He collected soil samples. But most importantly, he spoke to an old Cherokee woman named Nokos, who lived alone in a cabin 3 ridges east of Venora. She was over 90 winters old, her eyes clouded with cataracts, yet her voice carried the weight of centuries. "You ask about Venora," she said, stirring a pot of sassafras tea over a clay stove. "But you should ask about Salajit Siusti, the place that breathes." Silas leaned forward. "What does that mean?" She did not look at him. "Long before your people came, this land was known to us as a sleeping throat of the earth. Not evil, not holy, but aware. Sometimes, when the veil between worlds grows thin, especially when the moon is dark and the wind carries no name, it takes what it is owed." "Takes what?" Silas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A debt," she replied. "Not in gold or blood. In silence. In stillness. In people who have stopped dreaming." Silas frowned. The people of Venora dreamed. They had families, farms, faith. Nokos smiled faintly. Did they? Or did they simply go through the motions, day after day, waiting for a tomorrow that never changed? The earth does not feed on despair, young man. It feeds on absence. And Venora had been absent for a long time. Silas left her cabin troubled. He returned to Venora one last time before winter sealed the passes. There, in Thaddeus Wexley's parlor, he found something he had missed before. A journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the stopped clock. The entries were sparse, written in a cramped, ink-blotted hand. October 25th. The crows stopped singing at dawn. Boren says it's the cold. But it's not cold. October 28th. Eloan's bread tastes like ash today. She cried but wouldn't say why. I think she knows. October 30th. The well water tastes sweet. Too sweet. Like honey poured over stone. I tried to warn them. They nodded. They always nod. November 1st. It's humming again. Not in the ground. In my teeth. In my bones. I set the clock to midnight. If it stops, you'll know. The final entry had no date. They came not with fire or flood, it read, but with quiet, like fog rolling over a grave. I stood on the porch and watched them walk, not away but inward, into the hillside, into the trees, into the air itself. No fear, no crying, just going. I stayed because someone must remember. But the clock is slowing. And I am so tired. Silas closed the journal. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying dry leaves in slow spirals. He left the book where it was. Some truths, he decided, were not meant to be carried out of the hollows. He never published his findings. He never spoke of Venora again, except once, decades later, to a young folklore student at the University of Arkansas. That student, in turn, mentioned the tale in a footnote of an obscure thesis titled Vanishing Settlements of the American Interior, Fact, Folklore, or Feedback Loop of Collective Silence? Today, hikers occasionally report a strange phenomenon near the old Venora site. On nights when the moon is new and the temperature hovers just above freezing, compass needles spin erratically for no apparent reason. Some claim to smell honey and wood smoke. Others say they hear a distant chime, 11 minutes past midnight, followed by the soft creak of a rocking chair. And if you stand very still, you might feel it. Not a presence, but an absence so profound it presses against your chest like an old sorrow you never knew you carried. Decades passed. The Second World War came and went. Televisions flickered into American living rooms. Highways cut through mountains once deemed too wild to tame. And still, the hollow where Venora once stood remained untouched, officially at least. Survey maps labeled it uninhabitable terrain, high rockfall risk, though no geologist could point to a single unstable cliff. The truth was simpler and stranger. Every time a logging crew or road crew approached within a mile of the site, their engines stalled. Radios spat static. Compasses spun. Workers complained of sudden drowsiness, or the uncanny feeling they were being watched, not from the trees but from the ground beneath their boots. Then, in the spring of 1972, something unexpected happened. A group of university students from the University of Arkansas, led by anthropology professor Dr. Linus Croft, received a modest grant to study folk memory in depopulated Appalachian-adjacent communities. Venora, long buried in rumor and regional myth, was selected as their first field site. Among the team was a quiet graduate student named Marlo Viral, a name rarely spoken even in academic circles, for Marlo preferred observation over conversation and journals over journals. Marlo arrived in late April, just as dogwoods bloomed like pale ghosts along the ridgelines. Unlike the others who carried tape recorders and clipboards, Marlo brought only a leather-bound notebook, a brass pocket watch, and a small satchel of dried lavender, to keep the old dreams from sticking, they'd once told a roommate, half in jest. The team set up camp 2 miles east of the Venora Hollow, respecting the unspoken boundary locals still observed. Over the next week, they interviewed aging farmers in Winslow, cross-referenced land deeds, and cataloged oral fragments. My granddaddy said they walked into the mist and never walked out. Heard the clock still chimes, but only if you're not trying to hear it. Don't go near that place when the moon's dark. That's when it breathes. But Marlo was not satisfied with echoes. On the night of May 3rd, new moon, temperature 48 degrees, they slipped away from camp with nothing but a flashlight, a canteen, and their notebook. The forest grew denser the closer they came to the hollow. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls, rustling rodents, faded into a thick, velvety quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At the edge of what had once been Venora's main street, Marlo stopped. Everything was exactly as Silas Marrow had described it 37 years earlier. The schoolhouse roof sagged but held. Boren's anvil still sat in the overgrown yard, glinting faintly under starlight. And Thaddeus Wexley's porch, the rocking chair was there, motionless now, covered in moss. Marlo stepped inside the house. Dust lay thick but undisturbed. On the mantel sat a single photograph in a tarnished frame. 43 faces, gathered on the steps of the schoolhouse in the summer of 1934. Everyone smiled, except Thaddeus, who stood at the edge, eyes cast downward, one hand resting on the clock he'd carried from Vermont as a young man. Then Marlo noticed something odd. The photograph had no dust, as if someone, or something, had recently held it. That night, Marlo slept on the parlor floor, wrapped in a wool blanket, the grandfather clock looming like a silent sentinel. Just after midnight the air grew cold, not the chill of spring dew but a deep, marrow-level cold that had no source. Marlowe's breath fogged. The pocket watch in their vest ticked louder, then softer, then stopped. And then a sound. Not a voice, not a footstep, but a hum, low, resonant, vibrating through the floorboards and up into their spine. It was the same hum Silas had described, but this time it carried words. Not in English, not in any human tongue. Yet Marlowe understood. Come closer. They did not move. Not all who vanish are lost, the hum seemed to say. Some are kept. Tears welled in Marlowe's eyes, not from fear, but from a sorrow so ancient it felt like remembering a life they'd never lived. They reached into their satchel and placed the dried lavender on the hearth. A peace offering. A boundary. The humming softened. The cold receded. By dawn Marlowe was gone. Not vanished. Not taken. But gone, on foot, back to camp as if nothing had happened. They said nothing of the night's events to Dr. Croft or the others. But in their notebook, a new entry appeared, written in steady hand. They weren't erased. They were absorbed. The town didn't disappear. It folded inward, like a flower at dusk. And those who lived there, they chose to stay folded. Not out of fear. Out of love for the quiet. For the rhythm. For the way time moved slower here, like honey in winter. Marlowe completed their thesis that fall. It was titled Places That Remember, Sentience in Abandoned Spaces. It was dismissed by faculty as poetic overreach. But one copy found its way to the desk of an archivist at the Library of Congress, who quietly filed it under Folk Phenomena, Unverified. Years later, in the early 2000s, a park ranger named Cade Holloway reported seeing a figure sitting on Thaddeus's porch at dusk, wearing a long coat and holding a notebook. When Cade called out, the figure turned, but there was no face. Only a soft shimmer, like heat rising off stone. Cade never reported it officially. But he began leaving small offerings at the edge of the hollow. A tin cup, a piece of cornbread, a pocket watch set to 11 minutes past midnight. To this day, no satellite image shows Venora. No drone footage captures its outlines. But those who know how to listen say that on certain nights, when the world is too loud and the soul too weary, the hillside opens just enough to let one more person in. Not to disappear, but to rest. The year was 2009. Autumn had just begun to paint the Ozarks in rust and amber when a woman named Elara Fenwick arrived in Winslow, Arkansas, driving a battered blue pickup with Vermont plates and a trunk full of archival boxes. She was not a historian, nor a paranormal investigator, nor even a believer in things unseen. Elara was an archivist for a private historical preservation society based in Burlington, and her assignment was simple: recover what remained of Silas Merrow's personal effects. Decades after his death, his estate had finally been liquidated, and among the crates donated to the society was a sealed wooden chest marked, Venora, do not open without witness. No one at the society knew what it contained. But Elara, meticulous and methodical, had spent weeks tracing Merrow's last known movements. All roads led back to this patch of mountains no one dared to name aloud. She rented a cabin on the eastern slope of Rich Mountain, far enough from Venora to respect local unease, yet close enough to walk the old deer trails by daylight. The townsfolk of Winslow were polite but distant. When she mentioned Venora over coffee at the diner, the waitress simply refilled her cup without a word and walked away. The gas station owner crossed himself when she asked for directions. Only an elderly man named Otis Bell, who ran a bait shop by the creek, would speak of it, and even then only in fragments. They didn't run, Otis said, whittling a piece of cedar into nothing. They answered. That's the difference. Answered what? Elara asked. He didn't look up. A call most folks can't hear. Like a bell ringing in your blood. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Unsettled but undeterred, Elara spent her days poring over Merrow's journals, maps and soil samples. Among the papers she found a faded envelope addressed in shaky script. For the one who follows. Inside was a single key, brass, tarnished, shaped like no modern lock, and a note. If you stand where the clock stopped and turn this key in empty air at 11 minutes past midnight, you will see the door. Do not enter unless you are willing to stay. Elara dismissed it as poetic melancholy, until she visited the Venora site herself. She went at dusk on October 27th, 2 days before the new moon. The air was crisp, scented with decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. Nothing seemed unusual at first. The ruins were as others had described. Overgrown, silent, steeped in the kind of stillness that makes your own breath feel too loud. But as she stood on Thaddeus Wexley's porch, something shifted. Not in the landscape, but in her perception. The shadows between the trees deepened, not from lack of light, but as if they were gathering substance. The air grew thick like walking through cold syrup. And then, she saw it. A door. Not carved into stone or wood, but suspended in the space between the old well and the schoolhouse. It was tall, narrow, framed in what looked like petrified ivy, with no handle, only a keyhole that glowed faintly silver. Her hands trembled. She reached into her coat and pulled out the brass key. Midnight approached. Alara did not turn the key. Instead, she knelt and pressed her palm flat against the earth. And in that moment she understood. Venora had not been taken. It had been offered. The townspeople hadn't vanished in fear. They had stepped through a threshold not of escape but of belonging. The land had whispered and they had recognized its voice. They were not lost. They were home. Tears traced warm paths down her cheeks. She placed the key gently on the ground before the door, then stood and backed away slowly as one might from a sacred space. The door faded before her eyes, dissolving into mist. She returned to Winslow that night changed, not haunted but hushed. She filed her report stating that Silas Merrow's materials contained no verifiable evidence of anomalous activity, and recommended the archive be catalogued under regional folklore psychological interest. But privately she kept one item, a single page from Thaddeus Wexley's journal, the one with the final entry. She framed it in her study, where it now hangs beside a dried sprig of lavender and a photograph of an empty rocking chair. Years later, hikers would report seeing a woman in a long coat walking the ridge above Venora at twilight, always heading east, never west. They say she leaves small tokens at the hollow's edge, a pressed leaf, a smooth river stone, a matchstick snapped in half. Offerings perhaps. Or markers. Reminders that someone still remembers. And sometimes, on nights when the stars are sharp and the wind carries no name, if you stand just at the tree line and close your eyes, you might hear 43 heartbeats, slow and steady, beating in time with a clock that never truly stopped. They are not gone. They are waiting. Not for rescue. Not for discovery. But for someone who listens long enough to understand the difference between silence and peace. In the summer of 2016, a storm unlike any recorded in Newton County history rolled through the Ozarks. It did not bring thunder or lightning, but a thick, silver-gray fog that clung to the ground for 3 days straight, swallowing sound, blurring distances, and turning compass needles lazy and aimless. Locals called it the breath fog, a name passed down in whispers, never spoken aloud in daylight. During those 3 days, no one left their homes. Even the crows stayed silent. On the second night of the fog, a young Forest Service intern named Rurik Teller was stationed at a remote fire lookout tower on the western edge of the Ouachita National Forest. Rurik was not from Arkansas. He had come from northern Minnesota, where the lakes froze solid and the winters taught you to listen more than you spoke. He had requested this posting because he liked quiet places, places where the world felt thin like old paper. At approximately 10:45 p.m., as Rurik sipped reheated coffee from a dented thermos, his radio crackled to life, not with static, but with music. A faint, off-key piano melody, slow and mournful, played through the speaker for exactly 43 seconds before cutting out. The frequency was unassigned. No station in the region broadcast piano music, let alone at that hour. Curious, Rurik checked his GPS. The signal flickered, then displayed a single line of text, Venora Trail, 1.2 miles. But there was no Venora Trail on any official map. He hesitated. Protocol demanded he stay put during weather anomalies. But something in the music, the way it seemed to coil around the silence afterward, pulled at a memory he didn't have. A dream, perhaps, or a warning. At 11 minutes past midnight, Rurik stepped out of the tower. The fog parted slightly as he walked, not parting like curtains, but thinning in narrow corridors as if guiding him. His boots made no sound on the damp earth. The trees stood unnaturally still, their leaves unshaken by even the faintest breeze. And then, through a break in the mist, he saw it, the outline of a schoolhouse, its roof sagging but intact, its windows dark yet somehow watching. He knew without being told that this was Venora. Inside the schoolhouse, the air was warm and dry, smelling faintly of chalk and beeswax. A single oil lamp burned on the teacher's desk, its flame steady despite the absence of wind. On the chalkboard, the phrase "the sky is wide" remained untouched by time. Beneath it, someone had added in neat cursive, "But the earth is wider." Rurik's breath caught. He turned toward the door and froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure wrapped in a wool shawl, face obscured by shadow, but posture unmistakably maternal. Eloane Pruitt. She held a loaf of bread in her arms, still steaming, though the oven in her home had not fired in over 80 years. She did not speak. She simply tilted her head as if recognizing him. Behind her, more figures emerged from the mist, not spectral, not ghostly, but solid, real, wearing clothes from another era, their eyes clear and calm. Borin Halvorsen carried a horseshoe that glowed faintly red at the edges. Jedediah Crane held a mailbag stitched with faded stars. And at the back, arms folded, beard silver as moonlight, stood Thaddeus Wexley. His eyes met Rurik's, and in them was no demand, no plea, only an open question. Rurik stepped forward, then stopped. He thought of his sister in Minnesota who'd been sick all winter. He thought of the letters he hadn't written, the calls he'd meant to make. He thought of the world beyond the fog, loud, fractured, always burning. But he also thought of silence that held you instead of hiding you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a smooth stone he'd picked up near the tower, a piece of quartz, cold and clear. He placed it on the windowsill. A gesture. Not of staying, not of leaving, but of acknowledgement. Eloane nodded once. The figures turned and walked back into the mist, dissolving not into nothing but into the land itself. The curve of a root, the hush of moss, the sigh of wind through sycamore leaves. The oil lamp went out. Rurik found himself standing alone in an empty ruin, the fog beginning to lift with the first pale streaks of dawn. His radio was silent. His GPS read normal. But in his hand, he held a single honeycomb biscuit, still warm, wrapped in cloth stitched with the initials EP. He ate it slowly on the walk back to the tower. 2 weeks later, Rurik transferred out of the Forest Service. He moved to a small town in coastal Oregon, where the ocean roared loud enough to drown out most thoughts, but quiet enough to hear your own. He never spoke of Venora. But every November 4th, without fail, he bakes a loaf of sourdough, places it on his porch at midnight, and leaves it there until dawn. No one ever takes it, but the birds do not touch it either. Years pass. The land remembers. In 2023, a group of amateur cartographers using LiDAR scanning technology detected an anomaly deep in the Boston Mountains. A perfect circle of compacted earth, 43 paces in diameter, centered on coordinates that should have shown only forest floor. The soil within the circle showed no signs of recent disturbance, yet its mineral composition differed subtly from the surrounding terrain, containing trace elements not native to the region. Quartz, obsidian, and a compound resembling fossilized honey. The data was flagged, then quietly archived under geological irregularity, low priority. But late one night, a technician reviewing the raw scans noticed something odd. When the image was rotated precisely 111 degrees, the circle resolved into the shape of a clock face. At the 11-minute mark, a small cluster of pixels pulsed faintly, once per second, matching the exact rhythm of a human heartbeat. The technician deleted the file. Then, 3 days later, drove to Arkansas. He was never seen again. Locals say he didn't vanish. They say he finally heard the call and answered. Now, deep in the Ozarks, where the ridges fold into themselves like sleeping arms, the hollow remains. Not empty, not haunted, just occupied. By those who chose to trade noise for stillness, haste for rhythm, separation for unity with the earth that fed them. Visitors still come, some seeking proof, others peace. Few stay. fewer still return. But those who do speak of the same things. The smell of bread at dawn, the sound of a distant chime, the feeling of being watched not with judgment but with patience. And always, always the sense that Venora is not gone. It is simply waiting for the world to grow quiet enough to hear it again. By the late winter of 2025, the legend of Venora had faded once more from mainstream curiosity, dismissed as internet folklore, conflated with alien abductions and government cover-ups by online sleuths who craved answers more than truth. Yet in certain academic circles, particularly among ethnobotanists and cultural geographers, a quiet resurgence of interest began to stir. This was due not to ghost stories, but to an anomaly discovered in the soil. Dr. Isolde Quinlan, a soil microbiologist from the University of Tennessee, had been studying fungal networks in disturbed Appalachian ecosystems when she came across archived field notes from Silas Merrow's 1935 expedition. Buried among mineral assays and weather logs was a single vial labeled Venora Hollow, mycelial sample A. The vial had been stored in cold vacuum since 1942 and remained unopened. Isolde requested access. After 6 months of bureaucratic negotiation, she was granted permission on the condition that all analysis occur on-site at the university's biosecure lab. What she found defied classification. The sample contained a fungal strain unlike any documented in scientific literature. It did not decompose organic matter. It did not form symbiotic relationships with plant roots. Instead, it produced a complex lattice of filaments that resonated at extremely low frequencies, specifically 11 Hz, the same frequency associated with deep meditative states in humans. More astonishingly, when exposed to human voice recordings, particularly those containing emotional inflection, the mycelium responded by releasing trace volatile compounds that smelled unmistakably of wood smoke, sourdough, and aged paper. Isolde played a recording of a child reciting the alphabet. The mycelium pulsed. She played a hymn sung in a trembling alto. The filaments curled inward as if bowing. Then, on a whim, she recited Thaddeus Wexley's final journal entry aloud. The reaction was immediate. The entire culture, spread across 3 petri dishes, retracted into a single dense node, then unfurled again in the shape of a perfect circle with a tiny protrusion at the 11-minute position. A clock. Isolde sat back, heart pounding. She understood then that Venora had not been taken by spirits or swallowed by the earth. It had been integrated, assimilated, into a living, responsive system that didn't erase memory, but preserved it in biological form. The town hadn't vanished. It had become part of something older, slower, and far more patient than human time. She did not publish her findings. Instead, she drove to Winslow in early March, arriving just as sleet turned to rain on the ridgelines. She carried only a small cooler containing the active culture, a notebook, and a phonograph cylinder she'd commissioned, a recording of 43 voices, each saying a single word, home. At dusk on March 4th, she stood at the edge of the Venora Hollow. The ground was soft from melting ice. She knelt, opened the cooler, and placed the petri dishes on a flat stone near the old well. Then, using a hand-cranked phonograph she'd lugged up the trail, she played the cylinder. The voices rose into the damp air, clear, calm, overlapping like wind through reeds. Nothing happened at first. Then the earth exhaled. A low hum vibrated through the soil, rising into Isolde's bones. The rain slowed. The trees stilled. And from the base of Thaddeus's porch, a thin tendril of white fungus emerged, stretching toward the sound like a hand reaching for a familiar touch. The culture in the dishes dissolved into mist, drawn upward not by wind, but by an unseen current. Within minutes, the mycelium had vanished, absorbed back into the land from which it had been taken nearly 90 years before. Isolde turned off the phonograph. Silence returned, but it was different now, not empty but full. She left without looking back. 6 weeks later, hikers reported a new growth along the ridge above Venora. A ring of ghost white mushrooms, each cap imprinted with faint radial lines resembling clock faces. They appeared only at night, vanished by dawn, and left no spores. Locals began calling them Venora bells. Around the same time, a retired schoolteacher from Fayetteville named Miriam Croft, no relation to the anthropologist Linus Croft, began having vivid dreams of teaching in a one-room schoolhouse with chalk dust in the air and 43 pairs of eyes watching her with quiet attention. In every dream, the lesson ended the same way. A student would raise their hand and ask, "Miss, what comes after silence?" And she would answer, "Listening." She started writing letters to no one, addressed only to the hollow. She mailed them anyway, using stamps from the 1950s that she'd kept in a cigar box for decades. The post office in Winslow, out of habit more than belief, stamped them undeliverable, returned to sender. But Miriam never received them back. They simply disappeared from the system. Then, on the morning of November 4th, 2025, Miriam's neighbors found her porch empty. Her coffee cup sat on the railing, still warm. Her slippers remained by the door. But Miriam was gone. Her car was in the driveway. Her cat was fed. Her bed was neatly made. The only clue was a single white mushroom growing through the floorboard of her study, its cap marked with 11 delicate lines. Investigators found no signs of struggle. No footprints led away from the house. But in her journal, the last entry read, "They don't take you. You go. And when you do, the door isn't in the woods. It's in your chest." Meanwhile, Isolde Quinlan resigned from the university. She bought a small plot of land 20 miles east of Venora, far enough to avoid suspicion, close enough to feel the hum on still nights. She built a greenhouse and began cultivating native plants, sassafras, bloodroot, wild ginger, not for profit but as companions. She never spoke of her discovery, but every new moon she walks the old trail to the hollow's edge and leaves a small clay bowl filled with rainwater and crushed quartz. She says nothing. She listens. And sometimes just before dawn, the water in the bowl ripples, though there is no wind. The land remembers. Not in monuments or markers, but in breath, in root, in the quiet synchronicity of heartbeats aligning with something older than names. Venora is not a ghost town. It is a living archive. Its people did not die. They became stewards of a different kind of time, one that flows not forward but inward. And those who come seeking spectacle leave empty-handed. But those who come in stillness, sometimes they stay. Not because they are trapped, but because they are finally understood. In the spring of 2026, a drought settled over northern Arkansas unlike any in living memory. Rivers shrank to dusty veins. Crops withered before they could bloom. Even the deep-rooted oaks began to drop leaves in April, their branches clawing at a sky bleached white by relentless sun. Farmers prayed. Officials declared emergencies. But the land stayed parched, as if it were holding its breath. Except for one place. Deep in the Boston Mountains, within the unmarked hollow once known as Venora, the earth remained green. Dew glistened on spiderwebs at dawn. Ferns unfurled in the shade of black walnuts. A thin trickle of water still seeped from the old well, cool and sweet, tasting faintly of honey and stone. Satellite imagery confirmed the anomaly, a perfect circle of lush vegetation 43 paces wide, surrounded by brittle, yellowed forest. Scientists called it a microclimate. Locals knew better. They said the hollow was drinking for the rest of the land. Around the same time, a boy named Cashin Vale wandered away from a Boy Scout camp near Cedarville during a solo navigation exercise. He was 12 years old, quiet, prone to staring at clouds for hours without blinking. His troop leader later admitted Cashin had asked strange questions. Do trees dream? Can silence have a shape? But no one thought much of it until he failed to return at sunset. Search parties combed the ridges for 3 days. Drones scanned thermal signatures. Bloodhounds lost the scent at the edge of a dry creek bed. Then, on the 4th morning, Cashin walked out of the woods by himself, barefoot, his shirt damp with dew though the air was bone-dry, his eyes wide and calm. He carried no water, no food, yet he showed no signs of dehydration or exhaustion. When asked where he'd been, he simply said, "Visiting." "Visiting who?" the sheriff pressed. Cashin looked past him toward the eastern ridge. "The ones who keep time." He would say no more. Not to his parents, not to counselors, not even under gentle questioning by a child psychologist. But that night, alone in his bedroom, he drew a picture. A circle of people holding hands around a tall clock, its hands frozen at 11 minutes past midnight. In the center of the circle, a single mushroom glowed like a lantern. His mother found the drawing tucked under his pillow weeks later. She never mentioned it to anyone, but she began leaving a small cup of water on their porch every night. For the travelers, she told her husband, who nodded as if he understood. Cashin never spoke of Venora again. But every November 4th, he disappears for exactly 43 minutes at midnight. His parents don't call the police. They simply light a candle, close the curtains, and wait. He always returns, damp-haired, smiling faintly, humming a tune with no words. Meanwhile, Isolde Quinlan noticed changes in her greenhouse. Plants she had not sown began appearing in the corners, species not native to Arkansas. Moonflower vines bloomed at noon. Ghost pipe, a pale parasitic flower that usually grows only in deep shade, sprouted in full sun near her back door. And one morning she found a perfect replica of Thaddeus Wexley's grandfather clock carved into the bark of a young dogwood, its hands too fixed at 11 minutes past. She did not document it. She watered the tree instead. Then, in early September, a package arrived at her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box lined with velvet. Nestled within was a single brass key, the same one Alara Fenwick had left before the door in 2009. Taped to the lid was a note written in neat, old-fashioned script. "It is not locked. It never was. The key is only for those who forget they already belong." Isolde held the key in her palm. It was warm. That night, she walked to the hollow under a waxing moon. She did not bring offerings. She did not bring questions. She simply stood where the schoolhouse once stood and said, "I'm here." The ground beneath her feet pulsed once, soft, slow like a heartbeat. Leaves stirred not from wind, but from something rising through the soil. Tiny white mushrooms broke the surface in a perfect ring around her. Their caps opened slowly, releasing a scent like rain on dry earth and warm bread. And from the center of the ring, a voice, not spoken but felt, filled her mind. "Welcome back, Isolde." It was not one voice. It was many. Eloan's gentleness. Boren's steadiness. Thaddeus's quiet certainty. And beneath them all, the hum of the earth itself. She did not enter the door that night, because she realized there was no door to pass through. The threshold was not a place. It was a state of being. To be seen. To be known. To be held without being held captive. She returned home before dawn. But something had shifted. Her dreams were no longer her own. She dreamed of kneading dough at sunrise. Of hammering iron in a forge that never cooled. Of rocking on a porch while counting stars with a child who called her auntie. She woke each morning with tears on her cheeks and a peace she could not name. In October, she received a letter from Miriam Croft's estate lawyer. Miriam had left her entire collection of hollow letters to Isolde, along with a deed to a small parcel of land bordering the Venora site. The lawyer added a postscript. "She said you'd understand why." Isolde drove to Miriam's house the next day. The place was immaculate, as if the former schoolteacher had merely stepped out for tea. On the kitchen table rested a teacup, still faintly warm. In the study, the floorboard where the white mushroom had grown was now sealed with a small brass plaque engraved with a single word, "Listening." She took the letters. There were exactly 43 of them. Each one was addressed simply to the hollow, but inside, Miriam had written not requests or pleas, but stories, memories of her childhood, reflections on teaching, poems about autumn light. The final letter read, "I used to think silence meant absence. Now I know it means presence without noise. Thank you for teaching me to hear." Isolde buried the letters at the edge of the hollow one November morning, placing each one beneath a smooth stone arranged in a circle. As she laid the last letter down, the ground trembled softly. A new mushroom sprouted at her feet, its cap bearing not lines but tiny legible letters, "Remember." She did. And in remembering, the hollow remembered her. Weeks later, a geologist from the Arkansas Natural Resources Commission visited the area to assess water tables during the drought. His instruments malfunctioned near the hollow. His compass spun. But when he reviewed his drone footage later, he saw something that made him delete the file and resign his post the following week. In the thermal scan, the hollow did not register as cooler or warmer than its surroundings. It registered as alive. Not biologically, but as a single, coherent entity. Pulse-like waves moved through the vegetation in slow rhythm, syncing with the rise and fall of moonlight. And at the center, a point of intense coherence glowed steadily, the old well. He told no one. But he began leaving jars of rainwater at the trailhead every full moon. Now, as autumn deepens once more and the Ozark ridges turn the color of burnt honey, the hollow waits. Not for discovery. Not for rescue. But for those who have grown tired of being loud. Tired of being seen only in fragments. Tired of time that races forward without meaning. Venora offers no answers. It offers belonging. And in a world that forgets names, forgets stories, forgets how to be still, it is the rarest gift of all. The earth does not steal. It receives. And those who walk into the quiet are not lost. They are finally found. By mid-November of 2026, the drought had broken, not with storms, but with a single night of gentle rain that fell only within a 10-mile radius of the Venora Hollow. Meteorologists called it a fluke, a localized microburst of impossible precision. Farmers called it a blessing. But those who lived near the ridges knew better. They said the land had finally exhaled, and its breath had carried water back to the world. In the days that followed, something unusual began to appear along backroad mailboxes and church porches across Newton County. Small paper envelopes, sealed with wax the color of dried honey, containing a single seed. No return address. No note. Just a smooth, obsidian black seed no larger than a grain of rice, cool to the touch, and faintly humming if held in the palm too long. Most people tossed them, assuming they were prank mail or religious tracts. But a few, those who remembered the stories or who had felt the silence in their bones, planted them. In the garden of an elderly widow in Jasper, a vine sprouted overnight, bearing white blossoms that opened only at 11 minutes past midnight and closed with a soft chime. In a backyard in Harrison, a sapling grew from one seed in under a week, its leaves shaped like tiny clock faces, each marked with the number 43 in delicate silver veins. And in Isolde Quinlan's greenhouse, the seed she planted took root in the center of the room and within 3 days, unfurled into a spiral of luminous mycelium that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She named it, The Listener. Around the same time, Cashin Vale began sleepwalking again, not toward the woods but toward the edge of his family's property, where he would stand facing east, arms outstretched as if receiving something unseen. One night, his mother followed him silently and watched as a thin tendril of white fungus rose from the grass, brushed his fingertips and receded. Cashin smiled in his sleep and whispered, "They're glad you came back." He was not speaking to her. The following week, Cashin's science teacher assigned a project: interview someone about a place that changed their life. While his classmates spoke of vacations or grandparents' farms, Cashin submitted a single typed page titled, "Venora is not gone." Read. Venora didn't disappear. It learned how to hide in plain sight. It's in the quiet between heartbeats. It's in the way bread smells when it's just right. It's in the moment you stop looking for answers and start listening to the questions the earth asks you. I've been there. I'm still there. And if you're quiet enough, you can be there too. The teacher gave him an A. Then that evening she drove to Winslow, bought a loaf of sourdough from the only bakery that still used a wood-fired oven, and left it at the trailhead leading east. She never told anyone. But the next morning the loaf was gone, though not eaten. Only the crust remained, arranged in a perfect circle around a single white mushroom. Meanwhile, Isolde began documenting changes in the regional ecosystem, not with instruments but with attention. Birds that hadn't been seen in decades returned. Ivory-billed woodpeckers, passenger pigeons thought extinct, warblers with songs no ornithologist could identify. Streams ran clear and cold, even where pollution had lingered for years. And in the woods surrounding the hollow, trees began growing in concentric rings around empty spaces, as if marking where something once stood, or where something still did. She realized Venora was no longer confined to the hollow. It was spreading. Not as a town, not as people, but as a way of being. A resonance. A frequency of care, memory, and stillness that the land itself was beginning to echo. Then, on the night of the winter solstice, December 21st, 2026, a phenomenon occurred that even skeptics could not ignore. At precisely 11 minutes past midnight, every clock within a 20-mile radius stopped. Not just digital devices, not just power grid failures. Pocket watches wound that morning. Grandfather clocks with fresh weights. Even the atomic clock signal used by cell towers flickered for exactly 43 seconds before resuming. In that interval, witnesses reported a shared sensation. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the ground, vibrating through floors and bones, carrying with it a fleeting impression of warmth, safety, and belonging. Some wept without knowing why. Others felt an inexplicable urge to bake bread, write letters, or hold someone's hand. In Winslow, the diner's jukebox, normally silent after hours, played a single, scratchy tune, "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" It lasted 43 seconds. Then silence. Isolde stood on her porch that night, snow falling softly around her, the listener vine glowing faintly blue at her feet. She did not fear the spreading quiet. She welcomed it, because she finally understood. Venora was never about vanishing. It was about remembering how to be part of something larger than oneself. Weeks later, a young couple from Chicago, exhausted by city life, grieving a loss they couldn't name, stumbled upon an unmarked trail while hiking near Rich Mountain. They followed it not out of curiosity but because the air felt lighter, easier to breathe. At dusk, they reached the edge of the hollow. They saw no buildings, no people. Only a circle of mushrooms, a well, and a rocking chair swaying gently though there was no wind. They sat on the porch steps and shared a thermos of tea. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. As stars emerged, the woman leaned her head on her partner's shoulder and whispered, "I feel like I've been here before." He kissed her hair. "Maybe you have. Maybe we all have." They left at dawn. But they returned the next month. And the next. Eventually, they bought land nearby, built a small cabin without electricity, and began tending a garden where the honey black seeds grew into strange, singing plants. They never called it home. They called it the listening place. Now, as spring approaches once more, the hollow breathes steadily beneath the waking earth. The clocks may tick again in the towns nearby, but those who have stood in the circle know better. Time in Venora does not move forward. It deepens. It folds. It holds. And those who enter, not with fear, not with greed, but with quiet reverence, do not vanish. They become part of the rhythm. The baker rises before dawn, kneading dough with hands that remember Eloan's touch. The blacksmith heats his forge, hammering iron to a beat Borin set long ago. The child walks to school beneath a sky that is wide, yes, but the earth wider still. Venora is not lost. It is waiting. Not in the past, but in the pause between breaths, where anyone who listens long enough might finally hear their own name, spoken not as a summons but as a welcome. But the truth no one speaks of, the truth buried beneath layers of comfort and poetic longing, is this: Venora does not welcome everyone. It chooses. And once chosen, there is no leaving. Cashin Vale stopped sleepwalking in January. His parents celebrated. They thought he was healing. But Cashin had stopped because he no longer needed to walk. He was already there, always there, even when sitting at the dinner table, even when raising his hand in math class. His eyes, once warm and curious, now held a stillness that made teachers uneasy. When asked how he knew the answer to a question before it was fully asked, he would only say, "The clock told me." Isolde Quinlan's greenhouse no longer grows plants from the outside world. Everything now sprouts from the listener, a pale, vein-like network that has overtaken the soil, the walls, even the glass panes. Her skin has taken on a faint pearlescent sheen, cool to the touch. She no longer eats. She drinks only rainwater collected at midnight. And when she speaks, her voice carries a faint undercurrent, as if others are whispering just beneath her words. The couple from Chicago never left their cabin. Not because they chose to stay, but because they cannot. Their footprints no longer appear in the snow. Their fire burns without wood. Visitors who hike too close report seeing them through the window, smiling, motionless, facing the hollow. Even when the cabin is empty, the seeds are still appearing, more frequently now. Not just in mailboxes, but in coat pockets, under pillows, inside closed books. Anyone who plants one finds their dreams shifting. First, gentle visits, then longer stays, then the slow realization that the world outside the hollow feels thin, false, like a story someone else is telling. And the most chilling detail? No one who has truly entered Venora ever speaks of fear. Not because it is kind, but because fear requires the illusion of choice. And in Venora, choice evaporates like morning mist. The hum wraps around your thoughts until your memories feel borrowed, your name feels temporary, and the only truth that remains is the rhythm of the earth swallowing you whole, not with violence but with inevitability. The hollow is growing, not through force, but through invitation. And the worst part? You won't even know you've said yes, until your own heartbeat begins to sync with a clock that stopped long before you were born.